Hi, welcome to Session 8 of History 3380 World Civilizations. In the last couple of sessions, we've been looking at a complex set of factors that brought about significant change in the world, specifically the rise of modernity and modern societies. And those changes included things like the rise of capitalism, new ways of thinking by people, stresses on individualism, on rational thought, and of course radical change in political institutions with the revolutionary changes in England and France, the ideas of popular sovereignty, in particular the rights of citizens. All of these changes that we readily identify with what modernity is all about. What we're going to do now is look at how Europe, where many of these changes appeared in their most intense form, tended to disseminate these ideas and institutions, not always in their pure form, to much of the rest of the world in a series of encounters, but particularly not just through trade, but in the form of what we now refer to as imperialism. Because in the course of the late 18th and through the 19th century, the European powers imposed their total control, essentially, over 80% of the world, controlling the political and economic destinies of most of the world's population, at least for a relatively brief time, something around a century or so, which for historians is relatively brief. So we want to look at this process, and what I'm going to do today is talk about some of the reasons why imperialism took place, why Europeans were able to do this, why Europeans versus other people were able to impose their control over many other societies for a period of time. And then we're going to look at the evolution of the process, because it didn't start out as full-blown imperialism with the imposition of total colonial control. It evolved into that state, and we're going to look at the early stages of it today. And then next time we'll look at full-blown imperialism in the latter part of the 19th and through the first part of the 20th century. If we go to the first slide, we'll see some of the factors that led to this phenomena of imperialism. First of all, we saw that Europe was experiencing the Industrial Revolution, or the rise of capitalism, certainly by the 17th and 18th centuries, and those emerging industries were competing with each other in different European countries. And in competing with each other, they sought both raw materials to supply their operations and also markets in which they could sell their products. So as these modern corporate entities emerge, we have international competition among them, and key to that competition is both a supply of cheap raw materials, such as iron ore, coal, etc., and also markets in which they could sell their products. That was one of the factors, a basic economic factor, the search for raw materials and markets, that led Europeans into this process of imperialism. Another had to do with a developing sense of superiority on the part of the Europeans. This was not always true. It certainly wasn't true during the period of the early trading empires, when Europeans were out first encountering Africans and people in India and China. But as we get into especially the 19th century, the late 18th and into the 19th century, there is this growing sense by Europeans that they are indeed superior to other human beings on the Earth's surface. Part of this was encouraged by certain streams of intellectual thought. One of them was social Darwinism, propounded by Herbert Spencer. Social Darwinism was in many ways a distortion of Darwinian thought. Darwin's ideas about the survival of the fittest. What Darwin was talking about was the fact that certain mutations in animals and other living species make those particular animals or plants, etc., more survivable. They survive more effectively in their environment. If you think about the attack of the Black Death, the pandemic, why did certain people survive? Well, in many cases because they had a certain set of genes that gave them a greater resistance to the disease than other people had. That's the kind of thing that Darwin was talking about. Well, those people, because of a chance existence of a certain gene in their body, would tend to be the ones who would survive, and therefore their descendants would come to dominate. But what Spencer was talking about was the idea that human beings, human societies are in conflict with each other. And in those conflicts, it is the superior human beings who will dominate. So he takes what was basically a rule of happenstance for Darwin and looking at how the various species had evolved in the world, and Spencer turned it into this idea that, well, conflict is the expression of conflict between superior and inferior groups. And those groups specifically in Europe were defined as races. Increasingly, European intellectuals came to believe in the 19th century that the world was composed of superior and inferior races, not surprisingly theirs being the superior one. And that they believed that they could prove this through various methods such as the size of brain cavities, etc. This meant, in the minds of Europeans, that their expansion into the world would lead inevitably to domination, and one that was dictated by the physical realities, what they believed to be physically defined differences between different races of human beings that made some of them superior and others inferior. So this gives another impetus to imperialism, the idea that, well, look, we're on a mission, and it's an inevitable mission. We're destined to do this. We can't help it. It's because of our makeup as white human beings. We're destined to dominate non-white peoples in the world. There was a more beneficent perspective on imperialism as well, driven by the missionary impulses of Christianity. The idea that Christians were destined to go out and, as Christ had dictated, teach all nations, spread their religion. And this did take on an element of social service. Missionaries, medical missionaries like Dr. David Livingstone, a famous British physician who worked in Africa. Christian missionaries often went out with the idea that they would indeed better humankind as a whole as a part of the process of spreading Christianity. So this provided another impetus for what the Europeans were doing. Finally, a factor that lies outside the scope of Europe itself was the reality that in different parts of the world, there was a destabilization of social and political institutions. We've seen this happen in Europe. If we look at England during the Civil War, French Revolution, etc., there are a number of instances where cultures may destabilize for a period of time. Some of this is due to internal conditions. Some of it's due to, in fact, the encounters with the West that were taking place during the age of the trading empires. So it's a combination of factors, and we will see different instances. China, for example, we can trace both the influence of the West, but we also see the decline of the governing effectiveness of succeeding empires in China in trying to cope with issues like population explosion. As these things happen, as we have destabilization in other societies around the world, it creates opportunities, of course, for the Europeans to intervene and impose their control over these areas. And in fact, they often read these periods of instability as a threat to their economic interests. So they often wound up seizing areas that they might not have a direct economic interest in, but they felt that the threat of instability on the borders of regions which they controlled. This often happened in Africa, where they might have interests on the coast, and yet the British and others would wind up seizing territories far inland because of instability further inland that threatened their economic interest on the coast. So the destabilization of certain societies around the globe in the 19th century in particular created an opportunity for the Europeans to impose control, and often a desire to do so to protect economic interests that they had developed. The impact of these developments was very clear by 1914. Europe and the colonies that it controlled comprised 80% of the world in 1914. In other words, if we went around the globe and just added up all the territories controlled by the Europeans directly and through their colonial system, would be accounting for 80% of the world. A lot. Great Britain, which had by far the largest and most powerful of these empires, accounted for 25% of the world's people. And most of those were people who had been subjected to the control of the British. So this is a massive process which comes to incorporate tens and then hundreds of millions of people eventually, who fall under the control of these various European empires. And we can see this not only in statistics, but I'm going to show you a couple of maps that further illustrate this point in a rather graphic fashion. This first map is, of course, the world. And the pink, this is around 1930. The pink areas constitute Britain itself here, and then its various colonies, like Canada, a string of colonies from Egypt all the way to South Africa, in Africa, parts of the Middle East, of parts that they had seized from the old Ottoman Empire as it went into decline, and then what constitutes today India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, that whole area, and of course Australia, and even parts of New Guinea. That's just the British alone controlling all of these vast territories in the world. And then if we look at this other map, this is Africa in 1914, and here these colonies, the sort of rust-colored, are the British colonies again, and we see several over here, Nigeria and the Gold Coast. And here are French colonies. Over here we have, with the blue, the German colonies. But this entire region, the only place left not under direct European control was Abyssinia, or what we know today as Ethiopia. The rest of Africa had been totally carved up in the course of a relatively few decades and turned into a series of European empires. Now, how all of this happened, how it was possible for the Europeans to do this, has to do particularly with technologies that for a time, at least, Europeans controlled certain technologies which gave them considerable advantages over other countries, other societies. Steamboats, basically steam-powered sailing vessels, which could move into almost any type of waters, navigate almost anywhere. We're not subject to wind, water, or what have you in terms of changing conditions, allowed the European powers to develop powerful navies which could sail anywhere in a relatively short time and deliver considerable numbers of troops and, of course, weaponry, so that the Europeans could extend their power into far-flung areas of the world. Railroads were another one. Railroads, of course, had powerful economic purpose of moving goods rapidly across landed surfaces. But beyond that, they served an incredible military purpose that you could also move troops. Once you've taken a region, one of the problems that's extended back through time for virtually every empire of the past was, sure, it's one thing to conquer vast areas, but can you hold on to them and maintain control from some centralized spot? The Mongols had certainly run into this problem. Ancient conquerors, like the Romans, had encountered similar difficulties. Here, with railroads, you could basically solve that problem, because now you could move troops with incredible rapidity despite perhaps difficult topography, such as mountains, deserts, etc. You could overcome all of that. And on top of that, communications devices, telegraph, telephone, wireless. All of these communications devices meant rapid communication, and this again enhanced control by the Europeans. They could overcome problems in the past where rebellions might break out in an imperial system, and it might be months, if not longer, before the imperial ruler finds out that the rebellion has even started. Now, there is virtually instantaneous communication between the far-flung provinces of the empires and their capitals back in Europe. So these technologies, at least for a time, gave the Europeans a superior position, and it further encouraged them to believe, in fact, that they were basically inherently superior to other human beings, other cultures in the world. But of course, as they and we soon learned, those technologies can quickly be imitated by other societies in the world. And when I say quickly, within half a century, other societies can learn to produce the same kinds of technologies and use them just as effectively, so that this advantage was going to be very much short-term in terms of this type of technological advantage. And of course, along with these come various weapons that the Europeans produce, such as machine guns, long-range artillery. All of this gives them at least a temporary advantage in imposing their will on much of the world. Now, as I said, this process isn't one that occurs instantaneously. It's not as if the Europeans, like when the Spanish and the Portuguese went out exploring, and the Dutch in the 15th, 16th centuries, that suddenly they were in position to impose their will everywhere. That did happen in the Western Hemisphere, but that was the rare exception. In Africa, the Middle East, Asia, the Europeans were there to conduct trade, but they were not there to control those regions of the world. They simply weren't capable of doing that. It's a process that evolves over time as these trading relationships are converted into relationships of dominance. And those are the kinds of relationships we're going to be looking at first today, these sort of intimations of colonialism, as I've put here. In other words, how did this process get started? What were the relationships like, and how did the Europeans move into positions of control? Because it's not really until the 19th century that we can really talk about outright European imperialism in much of the globe. Now, this process starts, as I suggested, with the trading empires, as various empires, not only the Europeans, of course, but the Ottomans, reach out into the globe, expanding their trading networks, and in the process enhancing their power and their territorial control. Among those new trading empires was, of course, the Netherlands. And the Dutch, although they're relative latecomers to the game, the Portuguese are way ahead of them. They've already circumnavigated the African continent, and of course they've established their trading outposts in the Indian Ocean and on to China itself. And the Dutch really get started essentially as assistants to the Portuguese. The Portuguese had problems in terms of a limited number of ships that they controlled, a shortage of able-bodied seamen and captains, and so they essentially contracted out some of their imperial enterprise, that of trading at least, to the Dutch. And the Dutch, in the process, gained invaluable knowledge about trading routes, about the ocean currents, about wind currents, all of which would allow them to begin moving into the Indian Ocean on their own ticket as the decades passed, and indeed eventually challenging the Portuguese control in the Indian Ocean in terms of the monopolies that the that the Portuguese had tried to create. The most striking example, of course, was the Dutch moving into the Spice Islands, parts of, again, the Indonesian archipelago. Here, the Portuguese had established essentially a monopoly by establishing choke points that controlled much of the trade along the courses of the Indian Ocean. The Dutch come in and they establish a land-based control at Batavia on the island of Java in 1619. Batavia becomes the center of their operations. But this is not a territorial empire, and it isn't even an empire per se. The Dutch are there, but they are not there to dominate the region itself, to dominate the Spice Islands. They want to try to control that trade, particularly that trade as it passes on to Europe. But when they move into Batavia, that's their name for it, on the island of Java in 1619, they are there rather simply to try to conduct trade rather than to impose total control. In fact, during their early presence there, in the 1620s, 30s, and so forth, they were actually making tribute payments to the dominant political force on the island, the sultans of Mataram. So they are actually tribute payers. Here are the Dutch, and whatever their aspirations to control the spice trade in Europe, the fact is they are there paying tribute to the political entity, the Sultanate of Mataram, which controls the island. So this is clearly not a colonial system at this point. The local powers are in control. However, as time passes, the Dutch come to institutionalize their trading networks, the creation of the Dutch East India Company. Again, it was a monopoly created by the Dutch government to control the trade in the Indian Ocean. And it had not only the powers of a typical commercial enterprise, in other words, the right to conduct trade, to loan money, purchase goods, contract for ships, it also had military power, just as the British East India Company did. In other words, the Dutch East India Company had troops at its disposal, and it was considered, at this time, a fairly routine part of doing business in the world, at least for the Europeans, is that when you went out, you didn't expect to be welcomed with open arms necessarily, so you brought some arms with you to use against your opponents and to open up the system. So this is a massive government-sanctioned trading monopoly, which also has military power. And by the 1670s, the Dutch are reaching out to extend their influence further by manipulating the struggles for control of the Sultanate of Mataram, which meant they were involving themselves in local politics. Inevitably, with these sultanates, there are a number of different contending aspirants to the throne. Usually the Sultan has chosen one of his children, and usually they had a long list of male heirs who were eligible. And the Sultan might choose one, but that didn't mean that the other sons didn't feel equally entitled to the position and might not well take action to try to unseat their sibling who had been officially appointed as the Sultan. So there is a series of serious contests to control the Sultanate. And in those events, the Dutch East India Company throws its support to one rival or another in order to secure even greater trading advantages. Now, of course, the various rivals for the throne were quite willing to try to get the support of the Dutch because that would mean additional weaponry, and often gunpowder weapons in large numbers, sailing vessels that were heavily armed that could be used to assist one of the rivals for the Sultanate in seizing power. But in doing so, and this is not the only case we'll see of this, but by allying themselves with the Dutch in order to get control, succeeding sultans were also conceding a certain part of their power. If someone helps put you in office, you owe them a certain something. You know, if you stage a military coup, let's put it in contemporary terms, you're a civilian politician, you want to take power, you help encourage the military to topple the government and put you in power, well, you owe a lot to the military now. It's not the body electorate that puts you in power, it's the military, and so you're going to really have to answer to them. As a result, over time, as the Dutch East India Company involved itself ever more intimately in the internal politics of Java, the island increasingly comes directly under their control, so that by the 1750s, we have, in effect, the beginnings of colonialism in Java at this time. Now, something that's important to point out here in these early instances, because this isn't the only one. At this early stage, still, the attitudes of Europeans towards other cultures is still one of a sense of relative equality. And the Europeans know they have certain advantages in terms of certain technologies like weaponry, but they don't tend to dismiss the local culture and the local populations as inferior. They simply see them as potential rivals or as possibly allies as they try to expand their power. And in fact, many of the Europeans that came to the Spice Islands and other parts of the Indian Ocean region, such as the Indian subcontinent, often went native, as the European expression went. They would often adopt the dress and the dietary habits of the local population, the male figures, and it was almost always male figures who were going out as traders and as officials for the government. They often intermarried into the local population. So this idea of, well, the Europeans coming out from the beginning with this sense of superiority was not true. In these early ventures, such as the Dutch in Java, they didn't have that feeling. It would be more like, well, we're at war somewhere in Europe, and we're trying to ally ourselves with one group versus another, and we're trying to expand our control, but it's not like we view our opponents or our allies as fundamentally inferior. And there was very little reason for Europeans not to immerse themselves in other cultures, which at the time at least appeared to them to be at least the equals of their own. A somewhat similar case is that of the British in India. When the British first go to India and first begin establishing a presence there, they go essentially as supplicants. They secure trading outposts like Madras, Calcutta. And the way they do this is by working with local princes and getting their permission to trade. And of course, again, if we think about how trade worked in the Indian Ocean in past centuries, it's very much a free trade zone. And the principalities, sultanates, etc., thrive on the fact that they have an incredibly diverse constituency of merchants who might be coming from Africa, from China, from the Middle East, elsewhere, just as those early trading centers that we looked at initially in the course function, so too do the later types of sultanates and principalities in India and elsewhere, and that is the more the merrier. They encourage this diversity because, of course, it brings more trade and therefore more profit to them. So it was not unusual, anything out of the ordinary, for certain princes to grant trading rights to the British, because if they would bring more trade, more business, that meant more revenue for the local political entity. Now again, like the Dutch, the British have created their own trading monopoly, the British East India Company, again a joint stock company controlled by large merchants. Remember how Charles I had a few problems with this because of his support of it. And again, it had the same kinds of functions as the Dutch company, including military capacity. Furthermore, the British East India Company begins expanding its military power by recruiting locals to form essentially a mercenary army. They are what are known as the Sepoys. And these figures, these local people, are recruited as trained mercenaries to enhance the military power of the British East India Company. And it was a logical step. It is a sort of preamble to what will happen later on in the age of outright colonialism, when the British create massive imperial armies, largely made up of the local population. When we think of these empires, when you look back at those maps that I was showing you and think of the vast territories the Europeans would come to control, there was no way that the Europeans were going to be able to summon the sort of military force on their own to control these vast regions. Just wasn't feasible to do that. So instead what they would do is they would have their own military forces, but then train 10, 20, 30, 40 times as many people from among the locals to be troops in the imperial army. And of course we ask, well, why would you do that? You know, why would you agree to that? Well, practical matters. These people pay well. You know, it's worth it to them to pay these people well in order to recruit them into this military force. So this is another way the Europeans are able to expand their power, and we see this early on, even before outright colonialism comes to India later in the 18th century. Now, when I talked about earlier, when we were talking about ways that imperialism was finally able to develop, European colonialism, I talked about destabilization on the periphery, how certain societies underwent destabilizing periods. And this was true of the Mughal Empire in India. We talked about the Mughal Empire early on, this Islamic empire that had been the first empire to really control most of the Indian subcontinent. And I also mentioned that there were two types of administrators in the Mughal system. On the one hand, there were the Mansabdars, who were usually military leaders, who were rewarded for conquering areas by being allowed to control the collection of tribute in that region and then sharing it, of course, with the Mughal emperor. The others were the Zamorins, Hindu princes, who had been incorporated into the imperial system as well. Basically, a deal was struck. The Hindu prince would be allowed to maintain control in his region, and in return, he would carry out the bidding of the emperor, including the collection of tribute. Now, several different problems consistently roil the stability of this empire. Part of it has to do with unrest in the countryside, peasant rebellions. This is a problem that predates the Mughals. In fact, will continue throughout British rule afterwards. Part of it may be explained, we think, by disease. That given the largely tropical climate of India, its populations were subject to greater infestations of various forms of bacterial disease, parasites, hookworm, common in the American South, common in other warm climates in the world. And as a result, Indian peasants, although we can't prove this precisely, other than gross economic figures, but they may have been less physically robust and therefore less able to produce agricultural products. As the burdens of empire are imposed, in other words, you've got to pay tribute to the emperor, almost inevitably these burdens exceed the ability of the local populations to pay them, and rebellion from below results. Now, it's obviously not the only factor because other parts of the world have peasant rebellions too, but it may have contributed to the almost incessant uprisings that were going on in the Indian subcontinent. In addition to this basic problem that predated and would continue after the Mughal Empire, there is the fundamental issue of differences between religions, between Hindus and Muslims. But of course, this wasn't simply a matter of, oh, well, we have conflicting beliefs. If you think, for example, about the conflict in Northern Ireland, contemporary world, pitting Protestants against Catholics, and people say, oh, well, it's a religious conflict. Well, it is to the extent that the two groups can be divided between Catholics and Protestants, but the real issue is the Protestants have traditionally controlled the political institutions and the economic institutions of the North, and the Catholics have found themselves in a second-class position. So, of course, these two groups have conflicts, and as the numbers of Catholics have grown, the conflict between the Protestants and Catholics over who would control the region have intensified. Well, so too, in India, you've got a minority of Muslims who are controlling a majority of Hindus. And yes, there are religious differences, but one of the big differences is, well, who's in charge here? Is it us or them? And if it's them, then we're going to rebel against them because we're us. So religion, yes, but religion as it defined differences in relative power between the Islamic empire that controlled the region and the Hindus that made up the majority of the population. So we have an empire that's constantly facing these challenges of both rural rebellion and also conflicts between the two major religious groups. Into all of this comes this issue of the zamindars and the mansabdars. And I explained this briefly before, and essentially the issue was that the mansabdars were being moved around regularly by the emperor because he feared that they would become too fixed in place and be able to develop local support and potentially challenge his power. On the other hand, the Zamorins, the Hindu princes, couldn't be moved because their power stemmed from the fact that they were the local ruling elite. And the difference was that the mansabdars, given the fact that they were moved, or at least the emperor tried to move them on a regular basis, would tend to extract more resources from the local population, fearing that the next time that they were appointed to a position, it would be somewhere where revenues would be more scarce. On the other hand, the Zamorans, of course, knew that their base of support was in the local population, so they would be less demanding of the local population. So we have a split within the empire between these two groups. And eventually, as the empire faces these various conflicts, the two groups would essentially come to blows. And this occurred at the time when the British East India Company was expanding its power. If we go back to the slide for a second, we'll see that in the middle of the 18th century, this conflict between Hindus and Muslims, and specifically between Zamorans and Mansabdars, finally erupted into outright armed battle. And at the critical moment, the British East India Company intervened at the Battle of Plassey in 1757 on the side of the Zamorans. In a perhaps more dramatic fashion than what had happened with the Dutch in Java, but nevertheless, following the same principle, here you have this monopolistic European trading company, which also has an armed element to it, intervening in local politics on one side versus the other, and driving a wedge through the local political institutions and undermining the power of the central authority. And that's effectively what happens. From here on in, the Mughal Empire was going to rapidly disintegrate. And as it disintegrates, the British are there to pick up the pieces. So we see in both these instances, in Java and in India, how the presence of the Europeans at a time when disintegration was taking place had a critical effect in terms of the ability of the Europeans to intervene locally and begin imposing control. But again, in this early phase, the British do not have that kind of colonial mentality that characterized them later on. They have seen the extraordinary accomplishments of the civilizations that had dominated the Indian subcontinent for thousands of years. They're well aware of the not only architectural achievements, but political achievements, intellectual achievements, the development of mathematical sciences. And besides which, they're not there as missionaries at this point. In fact, the British East India Company tried to keep Protestant missionaries out of India originally because they didn't want to stir things up. You know, it was much easier to govern people by just saying, okay, we're here, we're taking control, but we're going to leave you alone. You know, and that was usually what empires had done in the past. When the Ottoman Empire had allowed for the fact that it was conquering Christian and Jewish and other non-Islamic populations, and it largely left them in peace because you don't want to stir them up and you want to keep them there doing whatever valuable things they do. The British East India Company felt the same way, and it was really the ruling power for a time in India. They don't want Christian missionaries in there because that will unsettle the local conditions, and that's the last thing they want. So here again we have circumstances where the attitudes of Europeans are very different at the early stages of this process than they will be later on as more formal institutions of colonialism are created. A third region where the Europeans would come to exercise enormous influence, indeed where they would come to totally dominate, is Africa. Now, European relations with Africa, as we've seen, were governed to a considerable degree through several centuries by the slave trade. Really from the time that the Portuguese first started exploring along the coast, right down to the beginnings of the 19th century, when Britain decides that it's going to end the slave trade. Really for 300 years. The critical factor in the relationship between Europe and much of Africa, particularly the coastal regions of Africa, both west and east coast, was the slave trade. And we know that this was largely done in order to secure vast populations of labor to work the sugar plantations of the Caribbean, of South America, the cotton plantations of the southern United States. For this reason, millions of people were taken from Africa to labor in these economic institutions. So in many ways, the sugar industry, which helped give rise to the modern mechanisms of capitalism, was really built on the slave labor of Africans. Now, a critical element in the trade for slaves was weapons. Not surprisingly, African tribal leaders saw in the weaponry of the Europeans, these gunpowder weapons, a critical technology which could help them expand their power and control. So we get this exchange of weaponry. Not it was the only exchange, but an exchange of weaponry for human beings. Of course, what that also does is accelerate the intensity of violence in Africa. I mean, tribal groups were contending with each other all over Africa down through the centuries. But now those people are armed with far more deadly weapons, and the toll from these conflicts is going to increase dramatically. Between that, the taking of millions of people as slaves, and the general disruptions caused by the slave trade and by the armed conflicts led to demographic stagnation, at least on the western coast of Africa, during the 17th and 18th centuries. I mean, it's going to be hard to keep, it's amazing. What's amazing is that the population didn't decline significantly. The fact is the population essentially stagnated. The fact that it didn't decline is probably due in part to the introduction of new food products, such as squashes, potatoes, etc., that had a higher caloric density and a higher nutritional density than did local products. That increased nutrition probably helped keep the population at least at a stagnant level, even as all of these other conditions were driving population down. Now, initially, the Portuguese and others, such as the Portuguese interaction in the Kingdom of the Congo, were dealing with local tribal leaders, the leaders of kin group, extended kin groups that we saw early on when we were talking about Mali and other parts of Africa. But as time proceeds, especially as we get to the 18th century, there's an important change going on in terms of who the Europeans are dealing with. Because what emerges as political institutions are disrupted, as the traditional empires, like we saw with Mali and the Kingdom of the Congo and others, as they disintegrate, a new group of actors emerges who are essentially merchants involved in the slave trade with the Europeans. And the term merchant princes is applied to them because they aspire to more than just trade, especially as there is the destabilization of existing political institutions. They begin to claim political power as well, partly because they can arm a group of followers and therefore impose their will on whatever region in which they operate. People like John Coney of the Gold Coast in Africa were typical of this new elite that was emerging in Africa at this time, made up of these merchant princes, a new source of authority, which is a further destabilizing factor here. Because traditionally, of course, the people who claim the right to rule are people who have that claim, at least in part, based on their lineage. Well, I'm the son of the chief, or the nephew, or the son of the chief's wife, depending on what kind of system we're talking about. But that's the basic idea of an extended kin group, which is another word for tribe. But now there's an alternative source of authority. People who don't make any claim to any particular lineage, but rather whose claim is, look, I have economic power, and that allows me to purchase military force, and so now I do have political power. So we have these two contending claims for legitimacy. And that is further going to destabilize the region. So even though the early European contacts with Africa, and indeed the contacts running through the 17th and into the 18th century, even though the Europeans are not there to conquer, because they really couldn't, they didn't have the capacity for it, disease again, they were suffering from all kinds of tropical diseases which took a huge toll on the Europeans, they simply couldn't lay claim to any real control. But on the other hand, conditions are such that political authority in the region is in part disintegrating because of the new intensified armed struggles, in part because of the slave trade, in part because there are new claimants to political authority in the form of these merchant princes. Now, the merchant princes' relationships with the Europeans varied. Usually, they were allies, for the obvious reason that it was in the interest of the merchant princes like John Conny to work closely with the Europeans, because the Europeans controlled the slave trade. You're going to sell your slaves, it's usually going to be to Europeans. But at times, they could be rivals as well, because merchant princes were often interested in extending their control. And in so doing, they might well overrun areas where other merchant princes were also doing business with the Europeans. So the Europeans would often feel that their interests were being threatened because these merchant princes were knocking each other off. And again, that's a form of stability, instability. Instability was bad for the slave trade. Who's controlling this region? Well, nobody is if we've got two merchant princes shooting at each other. So they were usually allies, but they could become rivals as well, further adding to the mix of uncertainty. So conditions in Africa between the 1500s and the end of the 18th century, the end of the 1700s, especially in the coastal regions and the immediate interior, become highly unstable between the inflow of arms, the scouring of the population for slaves, the political rivalries, mostly between merchant princes and tribal chiefs, but also between Europeans and merchant princes. And of course, underneath all of this is also rapid movements of population, people trying to flee the coast to get away from the slave trade itself. So these are conditions of enormous upheaval in Africa at this time. And this is not the only time that we will see this. In fact, we've already seen it to a degree in looking at the impact of trade in North America. When human societies come under enormous stress and dislocation, when traditional institutions appear to be overthrown or at least severely disrupted, people often will look to religious inspiration to try to recover from the traumas that they are suffering. And this was true in Africa. And one of the things that was indicative of this was a resurgence of Islam in this period as the slave trade was taking an enormous toll. In particular, there was a revival based on Sufism. Sufism is a form of messianic, or mystical, I should say, mystical Islam. A strong belief in a very personal and direct and emotional contact with God. Sufism helped lead a revival of Islam in northern Africa in this period, by the 18th century. Part of the appeal was that Sufism played down the importance of the reading of the Quran, the reading of the holy book. not because it wasn't important, but because it was believed that oral tradition, that personal experience were just as important. This was significant in helping Sufism to spread, because most people in Africa either didn't have a written language, two, didn't have access to the Quran in their own language, or one that they were familiar with. So this gave a sort of populist turn to Sufism and helped expand its influence in northern Africa. One example of this revival was the Sokoto Caliphate, which emerged in northwest Nigeria in 1804. It was an Islamic political entity which rode the wave of this Islamic revival, this Sufist-influenced Islamic revival. In the midst of all of the chaos being created by the slave trade, by the various political rivalries that were going on, here was a religiously inspired political institution to challenge the chaos that was enveloping so much of Africa. Now, from the European perspective, there's a lot less, let's say, understanding or analysis. The British, for example, who have significant trading interests along the coast of Nigeria, are not interested in analyzing the origins of an Islamic revival or Sufism. What they see is this rival state emerging, threatening their power and influence in the region. And eventually, they will topple the Sokoto Caliphate. They will help undermine it because they saw it as a threat. Now, their real economic interests originally were right along the coast, but they feared this rising Islamic power in the northwestern parts of Nigeria, and so that led them to move inland to face that and other challenges and try to suppress that kind of conflict. So again, what we can describe generally as instability encourages the Europeans to expand their control. The British are there in Nigeria basically to trade, things like rubber, etc., but then comes the threat of instability, and of course, the Sokoto Caliphate may be a perfectly stable regime, but from the perspective of the British, it's a destabilizing force because it threatens to rally local populations against the influence of the British. So here again, the destabilization out in the periphery is creating openings for the Europeans to move in and assert their control. An earlier example of this same process we saw with the Portuguese in the Kingdom of the Congo. When Diego Cao, a Portuguese explorer, arrived along the Congo River in 1482, he came to establish trade relationships with what was rumored to be a powerful empire in the region. And indeed, he had, in effect, stumbled upon the Kingdom of the Congo, a vast empire in the southwestern portion of Africa. The ruler of the Kingdom of the Congo was known as the Mani Congo. The Mani Congo was the leader of an extended kin group alliance. In other words, the kingdom, if you envision it sort of analytically in the abstract, worked like a pyramid, with the pieces of the pyramid composed of a series of tribes or kin groups, with one dominant tribe or kin group at the very top, the one controlled by the Mani Congo, who has then made alliances with the lower order, the subordinate kin groups, and the big men who rule each of those tribes. So you have the Mani Congo at the top, the king, the emperor if you want, and then these subordinated tribal groups below him, ruled each of them by, again, a kin group leader, people known as the big men. And the role of the Mani Congo in this system was not only political role, but also a critical economic function. It was the responsibility of the Mani Congo to be sure that the trade conducted between the Kingdom of the Congo and cultures and societies further to the north in Africa was conducted successfully. So he was not only a political ruler, he was sort of corporate executive as well. Furthermore, in times of armed conflict, he had to turn to the leaders of the subordinated tribes to secure forces to carry out wars. And this was always a somewhat delicate situation. Yes, everyone recognizes the Mani Congo as the ruler of the kingdom, but at the same time, potential rivals are always cropping up among these various big men. And he has to ask for the troops. He can't simply go out and order these people. This is not, a structured modern bureaucracy. He has to ask for the troops. He has to ask his allies, if you will, the big men, to provide those troops. In addition, much like the societies we saw in the Western Hemisphere, warfare was heavily influenced by religious leaders. Wars could not be undertaken unless religious leaders saw the proper signs, usually signs in nature itself. They might, open an animal and read the entrails. They might look for phenomena in the heavens to indicate whether, in fact, a war should be undertaken at a particular moment. And it was incumbent upon the Mani Congo to heed the advice of these religious leaders. Now, what's striking is that when the Portuguese arrived, the Mani Congo embraced them and quickly accepted religious conversion, became a Christian. This sudden embrace of the Portuguese was not as a result of them appearing as, these superior beings, but rather from very pragmatic decisions made by the Mani Congo. Specifically, the Mani Congo saw in the Europeans several powerful ways to enhance his authority. First of all, by religious conversion, he essentially set himself aside from local religious leaders. I'm a Christian. If I've decided to go to war, why would I listen to you people? You're pagans, at least from my perspective as a newborn Christian. So he frees himself of having to answer to the religious leaders in the local environment. And as for the Pope, the Pope's thousands of miles away. Don't have time to consult him. So I have opened up my opportunities for action in the world of warfare because I don't have to listen to religious leaders. Secondly, the Europeans brought those nice weapons of theirs. Yes, the Mani Congo still had to deal with the big men in terms of warfare and getting their permission to use their forces. But now he's in control of a technology that they don't have. So now he has much more control over his own subordinated tribal leaders because he has this incredibly powerful technology which he's securing from the Europeans. Now, of course, the key to all this, as you can imagine from what I've already said about Africa and the Europeans, was that the Europeans were looking particularly for slaves. And this would be the core of their relationship, that they would trade weapons for slaves, which in turn, from the perspective of the Mani Congo, enhanced his authority. They had freed him through religious conversion of listening to the local religious leaders, and now he had considerably greater authority, at least initially, over the local big men because he had access to this warfare technology that others did not. So here we have a situation where it's not a matter of, oh, there's a local crisis, as we saw in India and Java, and the Europeans involve themselves. Here it's a situation where a local leader sees an opportunity by allying himself with the Europeans to enhance his own authority. Indeed, when we look at the next slide, the successor to the original Mani Congo, who had embraced the Europeans, was his son, who took the Portuguese name Afonso. Not only is that significant in and of itself, that here is this African king who has taken on a European Christian name, but the fact is Afonso was not intended to be the next king. Succession in the Kingdom of the Congo was through the mother, not through the father. So the sons of the ruling Mani Congo were not supposed to be eligible to succeed him. But Afonso had gone to the Portuguese and made a claim, pointing out that, look, I'm a Christian, so I should be doing what Christian kings do. I should be succeeding to my father's throne. And indeed, he was backed up by the Portuguese and their weapons. But again, what we have now is a dependence upon the Portuguese, not only for weaponry, but literally the legitimacy of rule is based on a European idea, not on an African idea. So we have a ruler who starts out to increase his power, but winds up making himself and his heirs more dependent on the Europeans. And of course, the slave trade will rapidly take its toll on internal stability. As the Mani Congo's forces go out hunting for slaves, they are going to destabilize not only the societies around them, but their own society. By 1622, the Portuguese were taking an even more aggressive stance, using their own military forces to invade the southern parts of the Kingdom of the Congo to further enhance their access to slaves. By 1678, less than 150 years after the coming of the Portuguese, who came basically just to trade, the capital of the Kingdom of the Congo had been abandoned. The Kingdom of the Congo had collapsed. This intersection between these two very different cultures had led to the disintegration of the African state and society, the Kingdom of the Congo. So here again, we see, not immediately, but clearly, an opportunity is being opened up for the Europeans to advance and secure control, because through this set of interactions, none of them having the intended consequence of destroying the Kingdom of the Congo, but nevertheless, that is in fact what happens. Another example that follows, and this is why I mentioned the Kingdom of the Congo, even though it's not chronologically in line with the two previous ones, because we have another instance of this same type of process, where the decisions of local rulers, aware of the Europeans and their potential, that leads to the undermining of local political institutions, non-Western political institutions. Egypt was a province of the Ottoman Empire. We've seen, of course, the Ottoman Empire, one of the great trading empires of the earlier centuries from 1300 on down. However, the Ottoman Empire itself was steadily weakening as the centuries progressed, particularly by the 1600s and the 1700s. Part of the reason was that the Ottomans had run up against problems in expanding territorially. As they tried to expand north into Europe. They ran into both the Western European powers and also Russia. This meant less land, decreasing tribute collections. And as the Europeans went around Africa to tap the trade of the Indian Ocean, they diverted trade, at least some trade, away from the Ottomans. Now, this doesn't all happen overnight. It's not that dramatic and sudden, nor are these the only factors. But clearly, the Ottomans were weakening. Their system was starting to run down. That became painfully obvious when Napoleon Bonaparte invaded Egypt and occupied it in 1798. It became painfully obvious because Napoleon easily swept aside the local forces controlled by the Ottomans to occupy this region. And it was clear to anyone in Egypt just how powerful the technologies of the Europeans had become with this event. One of the people who learned from that was the man who became governor of Egypt, a man named Muhammad Ali. And by the way, he wasn't actually Egyptian, he was from the Balkans. But he was an Ottoman governor. Now, by this time, the governors of the various Ottoman provinces were starting to exercise considerable authority outside of the control of the Sultan. They always officially recognized the Ottoman Sultan as their ruler, but they often governed their provinces with considerable independence. And that's precisely what Muhammad Ali did. Between 1803 and 1846, the time he ruled Egypt as its governor, he made major strides towards creating a modern army, trying to replicate what he had seen with the French. And he also tried to commercialize agriculture by developing cotton plantations to create a vibrant local export economy, to try to modernize Egypt. He's one of the many non-Western leaders who will look at the West and say, well, that's the kind of system that we want. We want to create those kinds of resources, through powerful economic mechanisms and create a modern state, a modern military. All of that is possible by applying capitalism, by having capitalist production of agricultural products. We'll join that same economic race that the Europeans are being so successful at. So he wants to mimic, at least in some ways, particularly in terms of economics and military and the government bureaucracy, what he has seen in the West. One of his descendants continued this process, Ismail Pasha, who ruled Egypt in the 1860s and 70s. He continued to expand the system of cotton plantations. He borrowed money extensively from the European merchants, especially the French, who came to trade with Egypt. And he permitted the French to construct the Suez Canal. This would become another vital technology. Here, the Westerns would have the means to dig this canal that would become an incredibly important connection between Europe and Africa, the Middle East, Asia. Suddenly you didn't have to go all the way around the southern tip of Africa to get to Asia anymore. To get to India, China, you go through the Suez Canal. So here was this powerful technology brought in by the Europeans that Ismail Pasha saw advancing the modernization of Egypt. And along with that, he borrowed heavily, again, from European merchants, first the French, then the British. But these events were having a destabilizing effect of their own sort, just as the attempts of the Mani Congo in an earlier age to enhance his power, so too the attempt to enhance the power of the rulers of Egypt by modernizing created problems for them. There was a 40% decline in the number of peasants in Egypt who controlled their own land. Peasants were losing land to the large cotton plantations. Furthermore, thousands and thousands of Westerners with their secular ideas about separating religion and society, human societies, were pouring into Egypt as well, alienating both fervent religious believers and, of course, the clergy. Furthermore, many Egyptians were developing a strong sense of nationalism as the Europeans came and assumed these dominant positions. Many of the young military officers trained by the French and then the British, many young bureaucrats began resenting the control which the Europeans had over the economy, over the training of the military. This and financial difficulties, the fact that these loans were not being paid off rapidly, destabilized Egypt and finally led to direct British intervention and British control in 1883. How did it come about? It came about in no small part because a local leader, local ruler, looked towards Europe, saw this as the wave of the future, tried to modernize his own society, but in the process created a whole set of destabilizing forces involved with the rejection of European economic domination, the clash between Western culture and the Islamic culture of Egypt. These factors, the undermining of the position of the peasantry, all of these factors created forces opposed to this attempt at rapid modernization and helped lead to British control. So we've seen various ways in which the Europeans wind up achieving influence and then dominance in non-Western parts of the world by intervening in local politics in places like Java and India, and at the same time we see it in the impact of the slave trade and destabilizing Africa, and we see the examples in the Kingdom of the Congo and of Egypt of local rulers trying to enhance their own power and turning to the Europeans as a part of that process, but in the end eventually destabilizing their own societies and creating opportunities for European control. The last example is China. China was a powerful empire in its own right and had been trading with the West for centuries. But it sought to seriously limit that trade. By the 18th century, China limited European merchants to trading at only one city, the city of Canton, and only for a certain season of the year. The British, who prospered from this trade, found that they suffered, however, from a negative trade balance with China. The British bought tea in huge amounts from China, along with Chinese porcelains and other products that there was a huge market for back in England and Europe. But the Chinese had very little interest in European products. So the British were spending huge amounts of silver shipping it to China to pay for all the products that they were buying. Money was flowing out of Europe, but there was little coming back because the Chinese weren't buying anything. One thing that the Europeans and the British decided, in particular, that the Chinese would buy was opium. Opium addiction had long been a problem in the empire and had become significantly worse by the early 19th century. The British had access to opium. It was being grown in northeastern parts of the Indian subcontinent. So the British began smuggling opium into China. The Chinese emperor sends a government official, Commissioner Lin, to Canton to stop the trade, stop the smuggling, which he does by clamping down on the British merchants who are engaged in it. Here we have an instance not where a local political entity is embracing the Europeans, but rather rejecting them. And when that happened, the British brought their military might to bear. They attacked China in the Opium War of 1839, sending naval forces to attack China and force the Chinese to sign the Treaty of Nanjing, which turned over Hong Kong, gave the British total control of Hong Kong, which gave them essentially a land base on China's territory, and forced the Chinese to concede trading rights not in one port, but in 10 ports known as the treaty ports. So China was literally forced open by these actions on the part of the British. Here we have yet another avenue by which the Europeans gained access into, entree into the internal affairs of non-Western societies. We've seen three different major groupings of this: in India and Java, in Africa and Egypt, and now this third instance where there is actually not embracing the Europeans, as we saw in the previous two cases in Africa and Egypt, but in rejecting them. But by now, the Europeans are unwilling to accept rejection of their initiatives, and they use their military force to literally force open the doors of China, what had been the greatest of all the trading empires just a few short centuries earlier. We will see in the next half how this process accelerates into full-blown colonialism.